All right. Um, well, hello everyone. Delighted to see you here. My name is Leslie Brill. I'm president of the Bronx River Sound Shore Audubon Society, and we are thrilled to have with us tonight Erica DeLuca of the New York Botanical Garden, talking about problematic plant species of the New York City region and what to do about them.
Want to react with a clapping.
So
Thank you.
please mute yourselves. Feel free to react with little reactions. We will have an opportunity at the end to ask all of our questions out loud, or if you'd rather type them in the chat, I'll be reading the chat off at the end. So I'm going to introduce Erica by reading her bio. Erica DeLuca is a restoration practitioner who has worked in forest ecosystems within New York City for the past 15 years, including New York Botanical Garden for the past 13 years. The focus of her work is invasive plant management and how to effectively control these species while limiting impacts on the ecosystem and the environment. She has a BS from Michigan State University in environmental biology and zoology and an MS from Lehman College in geographic information science. She also teaches native plant identification and management at the New York Botanical Garden School of Professional Horticulture. So I will turn things over to Erica, and very happy to see everyone here. Get started.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you guys for inviting me, especially Bernie, who I've worked with for many, many years. So he's always talking up the meetings that you guys have. So I'm glad I finally get to attend one. So yeah, here is we'll get started, I guess. Okay, so Leslie already introduced me, so I guess I don't need to go over any of this stuff because we already talked about it. The only thing I did work at the New York Restoration Project, which is an AmeriCorps position. I did that for a couple of years, so that was really the only thing that I didn't include on that bio. But yeah, here's my email address if anyone has any questions or wants to talk to me afterwards. So, yeah, so let's just jump into it. Oh, I guess I'll just lay out what we're going to talk about, like, or how this talk's going to go, I guess. So we're going to start just by talking about some general sort of ideas about invasive plants, and then we'll talk about some legal definitions and some history of invasive plants, and then I'm going to do some ID, and we'll go over some of the pretty common species that you might see by you. So, sound good?
Yes.
Okay. All right, let's get started. So I wanted to start with this sort of quote. So let me read it to you. A weed is any plant that
Yes.
grows by itself in a place where people do not want it to grow. The term is a value judgment that humans apply to plants we do not like, not a biological characteristic. Calling a plant a weed gives us a license to eradicate it. In a similar vein, calling a plant invasive allows us to blame it for ruining the environment when really it is humans who are to blame. So this is sort of the beginning of this book that I really enjoy called Wild Urban Plants of the Northeast by Peter Del Tredici. He's a professor at Harvard University, but he's done a lot of work on urban plants and in the New England region. So if you're looking for a good book about invasive plants, this is a good one. So okay, so why I wanted to read that quote is because I feel like it sets a good tone for what this talk is sort of going to be about. Um, as most of you are probably aware, a lot of our environment issues are complex and far-reaching. Certain plant species have become the scapegoat for many environmental problems, from causing extinction of particular species to destroying habitat. And I'm not saying that these species are not problematic. However, they're not really generally the sole factor in causing these problems. And actually, it would be kind of nice if eradicating an invasive plant solved our environmental problems, because that would be actually easy, as hard as invasive plant management is. So, but we know it's not that easy. So, um, okay. So, what is an invasive plant? So, or an invasive species, sorry. An invasive species, this is a legal definition from the federal government. An invasive species means an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic, environmental harm, or harm to human health. So, um, I've been thinking a lot about the term invasive species, and I feel like I'm sort of having a complicated relationship with that term and thinking about it a lot, uh, especially within the field of ecological restoration. And that's why when I labeled this or when I titled this talk, I put problematic species instead of invasive species because I feel like when we say the word invasive that we need to have context with it. And if I just titled invasive, I feel like it's missing the context that we're going to talk about in the talk. So, and the context is that these species are not invasive everywhere, right? So where they originally evolved, they're important ecological plants, they're important cultural plants. They are could even be medicinal or plants that people eat, agriculture products. So, you know, I feel like I've been thinking about it, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with the fundamental attribution error problem that humans do. So that's the idea that if you see somebody doing something, you attribute a part of their personality based on a behavior that they do, right? So like if someone is late, you're like, oh, that person is irresponsible or they're lazy or whatever, and they have their own reasons for being late. And so to sort of put these characteristics on that behavior is kind of an error. And I feel like that's what we do a lot to plants. So we see invasive plants and we call them bad or we call them, evil or whatever. And actually, the plant is really actually just a very successful plant. So it's just doing what it's very good at. Um, so yeah, I've been trying to think about the words that I use really carefully. And these ads or these like flyers that people make with the, dead want like it's like a evil, like a criminal plan or something. It's not helpful. So this has been like a sort of a common theme in invasive species management that research regarding invasive species has long been criticized for a reliance on hyperbolic or sensationalistic language and often uses militaristic ideas. And so that's been a common um, thing that's came up in research. And there was a study that was done by this person in 2019, and they were trying to see if this was actually a real thing. Uh, so they did look at scientific journals versus non-scientific journals. And what they found was that in non-scientific journals, there was a tendency to use militaristic language. And in the scientific journals, they didn't really see that as much. And so the thought, why would we do this, right? So it's, we want to promote social cohesion and sort of effectively motivate people towards doing something about invasive species. However, that's sort of misleading, right? What it can do is lead to inaccurate perception of invasive species, contribute to social misunderstanding and xenophobia and loss of scientific credibility. And then it helps reinforce militaristic patterns of thought that are counterproductive to conservation, right? So what I think that conservation is really great for is engaging all sorts of people since we all need the environment, care about the environment. Uh, and we do that by engaging different groups of people. And so I've been thinking about this a lot and about the words that we use to describe things. And when we talk about some of the species later, you'll see that I sort of have tried to use different common names than what has historically been used for certain species for this reason, right? So, as I told you guys before, I teach at the School of Professional Horticulture and also the New York Botanical Gardens Adult Education Department. And I teach invasive plant management. And as I go through the class, I had a few years ago, I had one of my students, she came to me and she told me that, you know, we like so a lot of the invasive plants have names like, oh, Japanese, whatever, Chinese, whatever. And she was of Asian descent and she really felt like she wasn't a part of the field of restoration or that she didn't feel like she felt like she was part of the problem, right? And so that made me really like think about the names that we use a lot more carefully. And so I've been really trying since then to use different names, which can be a little bit of a challenge because sometimes you forget and other people don't know what you're talking about. But the more that we do it, the easier it gets and the more people know what we're talking about. So you'll notice that when we're going through some of the plants. So I'll try. I do sometimes forget, so you know, we all do our best. So and I kind of like this. I found this cartoon. Uh it's when anyone says alien, like people talk about species being alien, I always think of like aliens, not like something from somewhere else. Um, okay. So, okay. So, how did these species get here? So in the United States, most of the vertebrates and plant species that have been introduced were done so intentionally, while most of the microbes, invertebrates like insects have been introduced accidentally. Um, and then 99% of the crops and livestock that we depend on for our food products are not native to this area. So, and that is a huge economic field, right? So we're mostly going to be focusing on plants, right? So plants have mostly been introduced, like I said before, intentionally. And a lot of the plants that we see now as invasive in this region were introduced through the horticulture and nursery trades. And I'm going to tell you guys a little story about this guy, Philip Franz von Siebold, whatever you want to say his name as. So this guy was, what is my thing? Here we go. Okay, got my story. Okay, so von Siebold, he was a physician. He was born in like the early 1800s, right? He was a physician. He was born in Germany. He moves to the Dutch East Indies so he can work for their army. So he works for the army there. He gets stationed at a trading post outside of Japan. And he goes there, he starts working as a physician and treating some of the people that live in the area. He does that for a while. He gains the trust of the people, working as a physician, teaching them about the medicine that he knows, whatever. But while he's there, he starts seeing all these cool plants and he decides to start collecting plants. So as he's working, he's collecting plants. He amassed a collection of more than 1,000 plant specimens and a lot of other items of Japanese culture. And eventually he gets in possession of a map of Japan, which is very illegal for anyone outside of Japan to have a map of Japan in this time. And so the government finds out, they accuse him of treason, they banish him from Japan, um, but not before he can get out with all of his plant specimens and his collection of objects. So he goes back to the Netherlands, starts a nursery where he's cultivating and growing plants from Japan. One of which was Itadori knotweed. So the plant that is very problematic now. He was the first person to take that from Japan and start cultivating it and selling it in the nursery industry. So he wins awards for these plants. He makes a lot of money selling these plants. He wrote books regarding his work in Japan. And yeah, I think it's just sort of like just a really good example of what colonialism did to the people that it took advantage of, right? So this man he broke the law. He committed treason. He was banished from the country. He stole a bunch of stuff. He profited off of it, caused a lot of environmental problems for hundreds of years after he was alive. And he also got a lot of plants named after him. So things like the Siebold's viburnum. There's a lot of plants that have this Sieboldii specific epithet as their in their Latin name, and those are all named after this man. So he's obviously not the only one who did this, but I think he's a good example of what the horticulture industry sort of has did in the past. So, and yeah, we're still dealing with the repercussions of that now. So, okay, so these are all sort of accepted negatives of not native plant species, right? So it's generally accepted that introduction of non-native plants into an ecosystem reduces the biodiversity of the ecosystem, reduces the genetic diversity of the ecosystem, has a reduced hosting capacity for certain insects and birds and mammals.
Yeah, that's my friend Erica.
Hi. They can cause habitat degradation. We see changes to soil chemistry and nutrients, and we see disruption of ecosystem services like flood control, things like that. And then also they are habitat for disease vectors. Interestingly, some of our not native shrubs are really great habitat for the mice and the chipmunks and everything that carry Lyme disease. So you can get positive associations with Lyme disease and certain shrubs like red barberry. So interesting. So yeah, those are the general negatives that are associated with not native plants. So I was doing some research about birds, the effects of birds, effects on birds from non-native species, because generally what you hear, and I'm sure you guys have heard this before, that not native plants don't support birds. They don't, that the fruits are not as valuable foraging material for them. And I was trying to see if that was actually true. And so I read some papers, and it seems like from what I can read or what I read that it's not a black and white issue, right? So one of these articles, the one about how bad are invasive plants for birds, it talked about that we can't assume that not native plants are less valuable to birds, and that each individual species obviously has different benefits and cost for them. And some of them explicitly, the honeysuckle shrubs, the not native honeysuckle shrubs, were actually very beneficial to birds. They provided high prey biomass with high quality food, and they were frequent visitation spots for birds, while other ones like the red barberry were not. So it's not really black and white, it's very gray, which species are beneficial, which ones are not as beneficial. And then in the interesting, there was an article about Hawaii, birds in Hawaii, and it was talking about not native species filling a niche for a species that had gone extinct. So there was not native birds that were performing filling the same niche that a native bird had been doing, but that bird had gone extinct. And generally, when we talk about not native species, we are thinking about the context of this long evolutionary history that they have shared, and that's how they built these complex relationships. And we're sort of seeing that might not actually be necessary for these relationships. So in some cases, but like I said, it's not black and white. So, it's hard to say that certain things are good and certain things are bad, because there's, as you guys know, in nature, lots of gray area. So yeah. Okay. So we're going to start getting into some of the treatments for certain species. And I don't need you guys to, you guys don't need to know any of the stuff about unless you're interested about chemical applications and pesticides. However, I do want to point out, and I don't advocate for pesticide application. We're going to talk about a lot of different things, but pesticides, herbicides they are an option. You have to definitely weigh all the pluses and minuses, and I don't generally advocate for them in most circumstances, but I just want to let everyone know, if we're going to be talking about herbicides, the laws regarding herbicides. And so if there is definitely a difference between you applying herbicide on property that you own versus you applying herbicides on property that you do not own. So if you are applying herbicide on your own property, you do not need any sort of license for that. However, if you are applying herbicide on a property that you do not own, you are doing a commercial pesticide application, and you need to be properly licensed for that. So just as a FYI, we're going to be talking about herbicides. So don't want anyone going to prison for their herbicide application. So, okay. So I'm going to talk about different treatments for species based on their life cycle, right? So I break it down into three different categories, right? So we have annuals. So these are the plants that will grow every year from seed. We're also going to do herbaceous perennials. So these are plants that are herbaceous, non-woody, but they regrow from their roots every year. And then we'll talk about treatments for woody species like trees and shrubs and vines. And each sort of treatment that we're going to talk about, they all have benefits, they all have cost. Some are more feasible than others, depending on your situation, on your resources, all that. So yeah, when we're talking about annuals, annuals. So when we're talking about annuals, we are remembering that annuals are something that grows from seed every year. So when we're treating anything that's an annual, it's really important to try to treat it before it creates its seed, right? Because after it's already set its seed and the seeds are starting to spread, there's no point in treating the remaining plant, because that is just going to die before the end of the year. And sometimes follow-up treatments will be necessary until your seed bank is exhausted. So when we talk about seed bank, that's meaning the seeds that are in the soil, which some seeds can stay viable in soil for many, many years. So sometimes it takes a while. So for annuals, we can do hand pulling. This is generally pretty easy for most annuals since they don't really generate a lot of root material in the first year or during the year. Generally, you don't need a lot of tools, right? One of my favorite tools that I use all the time for invasive management is going to be this thing on the left there, which is a weeding fork. So I use this for like all day, every day, for any of the weeding that I'm doing. This can be really time consuming or impractical for a really large infestation. So you have to think about that. And sometimes too, you are causing some soil disturbance, and people point to soil disturbance as being sort of a factor for encouraging invasive plants to grow. So there's also mowing or cutting, right? So you can use your lawnmower or even a cutting tool like some hedge trimmers to cut certain plants down. And if you time this right, you can cut them down at the time where they won't be able to set their seed, which can be very helpful for annuals. It is faster generally than hand pulling. You're not disturbing the soil. If you're cutting with something like hedge trimmers, it can be pretty selective. However, you're just going to be mowing one area. It's not always useful for every species, so it won't work for all of them. And chemical applications are herbicides. Oops, sorry guys. I don't really want to talk a lot about herbicides because honestly, we'll talk a little bit more about it when I go through the individual species, but it's not really something that I advocate for, especially on a small scale like most people are doing in their house. It's not really necessary because there are environmental and human health concerns with that. There's also changes to soil chemistry and other unintended consequences. A lot of times there's overspray with some of the backpack sprays, so you can't be very selective. We also have to worry, especially with annuals, about herbicide resistance. So those are all sort of concerns. It can be fast though, so there's that. Okay. So our herbaceous perennials. So perennials would be our plants that are going to grow back year after year from their roots. So you can do hand pulling, right? If you had the time and the energy to do that. It can be pretty easy for most of the perennials. They do have a little bit more of root development than some of our other annuals, but it's still pretty practical unless you have a really large infestation. You can also do the similar mowing cutting. So if you time it right, you can also prevent the plant from going to seed. You're generally not going to kill most of your perennials by mowing them or cutting them down. But what you can do is sort of stop them from spreading. And then herbicides. So similar things to the annuals, right? You're going to be worried about environmental human concerns, herbicide resistance. Most herbicides are not selective, so they're going to kill everything that they come in contact with as far as plants go. And then we have some of our woody species. So these are going to be a little bit different than the herbaceous things. So a lot of the woody species, it's going to really vary on your treatment based on how big your specimen is, right? And sometimes you do need specialized tools. Like you see this person in the bottom left corner using, this is a specialized tool for forestry called a weed wrench. So this is designed to remove small trees. You can also use, pitchforks, loppers, things like that too are also generally necessary if you're going to be removing a lot of woody specimens. So Depending on how big your specimen is or how many you have, hand pulling can be a feasible method of control. And generally it works pretty good if you do a good job. There's also cutting or fruit removal. So this is what you guys have probably seen groups that do vine cutting on the sides of the roadways, things like that. And what this does is it stops seed production, right? That's the goal, or to help minimize damage or effects on nearby species, right? So when we're doing vine cutting, we're trying to minimize damage on the surrounding trees or whatever these vines are growing on. Generally, this will not kill whatever you are targeting. However, it can help, like I said, help it from spreading, help minimize the damage, and it's pretty quick. So there's also herbicide treatments that you can do on some of the woody species, and we have the same problems that we talked about with the other plants. And we'll go through some of the chemical treatments a little bit more closely. So there's sort of 3 different chemical sort of treatment methods that you can use, right? So number 1 is you have to look at your pesticide label, because not all pesticides are going to be labeled for every method or species. So you have to make sure that you're using the right product in the right method. So you have to check that. And then you have sort of 3 options, right? So this first one is called cut stump. This is where you would cut down a species and then you can apply an herbicide to the stump. This can be very selective, right? So you're really minimizing any contact with other species. It can take a little while. And you can sometimes, we'll talk about some of the clonal species, but sometimes it can trigger some of the clonal species to start sprouting. There's also this other option called basal bark treatment. So this is when you spray a chemical onto the stump or the bark of a tree or a shrub. And the chemical is absorbed through the bark and hopefully will work its way into the tree or shrub and kill it. So this is nice because it can often be done during the dormant season. So you don't, when you're a little bit less busy, but there are limited pesticide selections for this. And then the last method is called hack and squirt, when you like make some little notches in the bark of the tree or shrub, and then you can apply an herbicide into those little cuts. So similar to the cut stump, except you're not cutting the actual tree down. So yeah, these are all methods that can be done. I don't know, for any sort of homeowner, probably not super necessary to use herbicide like this. But in the professional sort of field, this can be something that's utilized if you want. So I don't really use a lot of these methods. We've really tried to steer away from a lot of the herbicides in recent years. There's more restrictions on them and more information is coming out about soil health and impacts on other species. So, okay. So those are all the methods. And when you're, the first step, we're going to talk about identification, but the first step is determining what species you have so that you can pick the best method for controlling that species. So identifying your species properly, getting to know the life cycle of that species, assessing your site for how much of that species that you have, and then selecting the best method of control based on all those things and based on what you are able to do. So yeah, let's talk about ID. So I know most of you guys are pros with bird identification, but some of you might not be as familiar with plant identification. And there's a few different things that can help you on your journey to figuring out what plants are in your area. One is books. And I mentioned this particular book before, Wild Urban Plants of the Northeast. I do like this book for this region. It has a lot of the plants that you're going to see that are considered not native, invasive in this region. There's also a lot of other books, so you don't have to stick to just that one, but I do like that one. As you're probably aware, there's also apps that can help you identify which plants you're dealing with. I use Plant Snap or Seek sometimes to help me figure stuff out, and they've gotten really good in the past couple years to really, they're pretty accurate. There's also the cooperative extensions. If you live in New York, Cornell, or in New Jersey, Rutgers, they can help you with plant-related questions. Most of us are probably in the Lower Hudson. So this Lower Hudson Prism, which is a collection of, it's like sort of a state-sponsored assemblage of people trying to work on invasive management, and they have some good information on their website. So all of those different resources can help you figure out what you are dealing with. So we're going to talk about some very basic plant features so that you can learn some identification skills. And one of the most important things, most of these are going to focus on on the woody species as far as characteristics to help you identify. So one of the important things to know what you're dealing with is if you have a plant with simple leaves or compound leaves. So a simple leaf is sort of what we think of as just a leaf. It's one leaf that's attached to a branch. This compound leaf is composed of multiple leaflets, so these little leaflets that all together are one leaf. And how you would be able to tell the difference is looking at where the bud is. So if you have a branch with a bud and one little leaf, that's a simple leaf. If you have a bud with this little branch coming out and you see multiple leaflets, that would be a compound leaf. And so it can be kind of confusing, but it's sort of just where the vascular tissue and the leaves are all connected to the tree. So if you look for that little bud, that will help you determine if you were dealing with a simple leaf or a compound leaf. There's also leaf arrangement. So the arrangement of the leaves on the branch can help you identify. And the two most common things that you'll see is going to be opposite or alternate. And then occasionally we see the whorled leaves. But opposite means that the two leaves are directly across from each other on a branch versus alternate where they're sort of staggered on the branch. Okay. And then we have some basic leaf features, which can help you with your identification skills too. So on the left, we have pinnate, a pinnate leaf. So that's almost like a feather, right? So we have the veins coming off that midrib. And then on the right side, there's a leaf that's called palmate. So that shape where the veins are coming from one sort of center point. It's kind of like a hand, palmate. And then the next diagram is a diagram of just we're talking about the edges of the leaf. So some leaves have smooth edges, and that's called entire. Some have teeth on the edges, and there's all sorts of different terms to describe the way the teeth are, but we can say toothed or serrate. I usually say tooth, but you could say serrate. And then we can also describe leaves that have deep indentations in them as lobed. Is that what it says? I can't see my picture. It says lobed, I think. Yeah. So yeah, that just sort of describes the deeper indentations into the leaf. So if you know those basic sort of features of the leaves and the branching patterns, it can really help you with your identification skills. and narrow down what you're talking about or what you're looking at. So I'm going to go through I'm going to try to go through quickly, I guess. We don't have much time. Through these different species, which I picked species that are common in this region. So species that I thought you might encounter in your daily life. And we're going to start with this Norway maple. So I also have the Latin names for those of you who are interested in learning that. So Acer platanoides. This is a Norway maple. So Norway maples will grow into large trees, and they have this maple-shaped leaf, which you probably are familiar with from the Canadian flag, but that's actually a sugar maple. So this palmate leaf with very sharp needle points on the tip. Another great clue is that Norway maples have a white milky sap. So if you break off a leaf and you waited for a second and see if anything came out of where you broke the leaf off, and it was a white milky sap, that would be a Norway maple. And since now we are in leafless season almost, you can identify some of our woody species with their buds, and which is kind of more of a little bit of an advanced identification tool, but Norway maples have these really large greenish red buds. And the biggest thing that we could confuse this with is a sugar maple. So when we want to make sure, obviously, when we're removing species, that we're going to be sure of our identification and we're not removing some of our great native species that we have that are so important. So if you look at the buds of the sugar maple, they're these pointy little brown buds, and the leaves are pointed on the tips, but they don't come to like a really sharp needle point. So that can help you with your identification of that. Okay. So next we have, I don't know if anyone has seen this around by them, but it's definitely a newer invasive that seems like it's spreading a lot in Westchester County. This is Angelica tree, so Aurelia alata. And this tree has really, really large compound leaves. That picture on the left, all those little leaflets, that's one big leaf. So it has really large compound leaves with spines on the leaf. It also has, you can see in the pictures of the stem and the branches, that it has spines all along the trunk and on the branches. And you're going to see it flowering with these really big white flowers in the late summer. There is a native species, Aurelia spinosa, the devil's walking stick, which looks very, very similar. A lot of people thought that this was the species that they were seeing when they were seeing Aurelia alata. Generally, the devil's walking stick has a southern range than the Angelica tree. However, who knows, with climate change, we might see some overlap. But they are really challenging to tell apart. So there are some books to help you with that too. So I can recommend some of that too, if that's of interest to you. Okay, so this is one that most people are probably familiar with, knotweed. This guy has these sort of spade-shaped leaves that are flat on one side and pointed on the other. They also have these thick stems that have distinct nodes and are often speckled with red or purple. A lot of people think they look similar to bamboo. And in the wintertime, you might see these pink or purple shoots popping up, and then the flowers in the late summer. So interestingly, the knotweeds are, in this region, we generally have, I tried to, I tried to change they were calling it Japanese knotweed, and I was trying to change it to Itadori knotweed, but my thing moved. So that's supposed to be up on top of the Japanese thing. Because I'm trying to change the names, so we don't say that. So anyways, there's sort of three are two species and one hybrid that we have in this region. It honestly isn't really that important to which one you're dealing with because you would treat them, they're all sort of treated similarly. It would just, if you are interested in knowing, there's the giant, there's the Itadori, and then they hybridize and create a hybrid called Bohemian knotweed. These guys are notoriously difficult to control. They have extensive rhizomes, so managing this species is pretty challenging. Clematis ternifolia. So this is the autumn virginsbower. This is a clematis species, which can look kind of similar to the native clematis that we have. However, the leaves have smooth margins on the edges, and the flowers are more like have a white tail, which I'll show you a picture on the other page of the native one. So the native has teeth on the margins of the leaves, and then the flowers are kind of like more fluffy. So that's our native clematis. So this is Lonicera japonica, which is a honeysuckle vine, gold and silver honeysuckle vine. This is a really common understory vine in this region, opposite leaves that have white or yellow flowers in the spring. The bark is generally, on the larger individuals, you're going to see like a light tan bark with reddish peeling. Sometimes in the spring, you'll see these lobed leaves that kind of look like an oak tree. We do have some native honeysuckle vines in this region. The biggest difference when you're looking for a native honeysuckle vine is that the end leaf is what we call perfoliate. So it's like, looks like it's sort of two leaves fused together, and the flower colors are different too. So there's some other twining vines too to be aware of, so you don't mix those up. This is a shrub. I don't know if anyone has seen this around. This one seems like it's increasing. I've been seeing Rhamnus cathartica, smooth buckthorn. So it's called buckthorn because there's often a thorn at the terminal end of the branch here. So sometimes you look at the end of the branch and you'll see this little thorn sticking out. Not at every single one, but yeah, look at a few branches. This plant has what we call sub-opposite leaf arrangement, which means is just a way to confuse you because most of the time it's opposite, but sometimes it's not. So, this can look a little bit like our native black cherries, so be aware of that. We also have bittersweet, which round-leaved bittersweet. I'm assuming that most people have probably encountered this species before. It's a twining vine, so it wraps around generally trees or whatever it can get onto, and that's where it causes some damage, is that it damages the trees by wrapping around them. In the spring and or the summertime, you'll see these round leaves with pointed tips. In the wintertime, you're going to see these sharp pointed buds where the leaves were before. We do have an American bittersweet, which they can look really similar. The biggest difference, and this species is not common, it has longer leaves and that only has fruit at the very end of the vine. Okay, porcelain berry. This is a plant that's in the grape family, so it can look similar to a grapevine, right? It has these little tendrils that it uses for climbing on things. This time of year, you're going to see these brightly colored purple, blue, pink fruits, which are really quite pretty, which is why it was planted and grown ornamentally. And then it has these leaves that they're palmate with varying degrees of lobing. So sometimes they'll be pretty deeply lobed, sometimes they'll be more entire, like a grape leaf. And I have a picture of a grape leaf on the other page here. So this one on the right is a grape. The biggest difference between the grape is going to be the bark. So the grapevines have these peely barks, that are like sort of peel in like long strips. In the wintertime, Virginia creeper can look a lot like porcelain berry, and a lot of people start learning about invasive species and they think that all vines are bad. And I've had this actually happen in the forest that I work at, is that people see vines growing on trees and they're trying to be helpful and think that they're doing something good, and they'll start ripping the vines off the trees because they've heard that vines are bad. Uh, However, we have a lot of really great native vines like Virginia creeper, poison ivy, which are important parts of our habitat. So don't do that. Okay, multiflora rose. This is a rose species, which you might be like, oh, how am I supposed to tell if it's another type of rose? And what you got to do is look at the base of the leaf. So this is called the stipule. This is where the leaf is coming out of the branch. It has little fringes on it. And I'll show you a picture of our native rose. And that is what the stipule on the native rose looks like. So that's how you can tell the difference between those. I think I might be going a little bit. Let me skip over some of these. How many more? Oh, I don't have that many more. Okay, let's do this guy because this guy's pretty common. Red barberry. So this guy's pretty distinct. So this is a shrub. And how you're going to identify this species is that it has these little leaves that are spoon-shaped, I guess they call them. They're sort of like rounded on one corner and yeah, they look like a spoon. However, it also has a lot of spines all over the stem. And this time of year, you're going to start seeing the berries, which will persist throughout the winter. So that can help you ID in the winter. And then it has this habit where it's just sort of like arching over and forms these really dense thickets. And this is one of the species I was talking about that's positively associated with Lyme disease. So when you have a lot of barberry in your ecosystem, you generally have higher amounts of Lyme disease because of the rodent habitat. So we do have a native barberry, which is pretty uncommon, but something to keep in mind. And I'm sure most people have seen this shrub, winged burning bush. So this is a really common ornamental shrub that people put in their yards, landscapers. And how you're going to be able to tell this species is it has these opposite leaves. And it's called winged burning bush because it gets these sort of little winged growths coming out of the branches. In the fall, it turns bright red. And the fruits are also red, and they will generally persist throughout the winter. We do have a native euonymus too. It's not very common either, so, but be aware of that. And my last species that I'm going to talk about is stiltgrass, Microstygium viminum. This is an annual grass species so everyone, when they start thinking about grasses, they're like, oh no, I can't identify grasses. Like that's impossible. But this one is not too bad. So what you're going to look for is this kind of like wider leaf blade than what you would normally see on a grass. And right on the midrib, it's kind of white or clear. And it has this very like bamboo, like sprawling habit where it just looks like a light fluffy cloud. And that's when it's not mowed. Like it does grow a lot in turf and grass. So if you do mow your grass, you'll see it just like shorter. It won't be this big sprawling, but you could still tell by the leaves. And this grass is an annual, so trying to manage it before it starts flowering and fruiting towards the end of the summer is really important. So as far as lookalikes, I feel like it looks a little bit like some of the Persicaria species that we have, the lady's thumbs. And then here is, on the right side, is a native grass that we have in this region. That is the most common look alike for it. So because of the wide leaf blade. But if you look at the stem of this species, you'll see it has this little hairy little ring, which the stiltgrass lacks. So yeah, that's the end of my little plants. The quick plant ID section. So, so yeah. And there's a little salamander I found at work. So I thought you guys might enjoy that little guy.
How cute. Thank you so much. So
Yeah,
interesting
you're
and
welcome.
informative. I really appreciate your careful thought around the terminology of this field and trying to help make it less judgmental and more inclusive.
Yeah, I know that you guys in the bird community have been struggling with that sort of those ideas too. So I think it's important for everyone in sort of all aspects of environmental things so that we can encourage anyone who wants to be involved can be involved. So
I come from a foraging background also, so that's another field. We eat a lot of these a lot of these things.
yeah, a lot of these species are edible. They were important species for where they came from. So
Yes. Well, does anyone have, I see we have a comment in the chat, but first I'd like to give people an opportunity to ask questions out loud if anyone has any questions. And if you do, please unmute yourself because everyone's on mute currently. Hang on just a sec.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
So I'm on the board of a small nonprofit that helps manage a local park. And we have almost all of those invasive species
yeah.
on the park. So we're, I guess in terms of priority, the one I've been giving the highest priority lately, although it's one of the hardest to tackle, has been Japanese or Itadori knotweed. So I'm trying to, and we also have multiflora rose, we have burning bush, and there's like it's so hard to know. Like I wanted to just take a chainsaw and cut down all the burning bush, but then someone told me, who I think now works at the New York Botanical Gardens, that he observed a lot of birds nesting in burning bush. And so I was like, oh, I don't know. It's just hard to know sometimes where to prioritize and what to do. So when you're kind of in an urban area like Westchester, where we have a lot of everything,
Yeah.
like, I don't know, how do you prioritize? I guess maybe go for the most aggressive. I mean, knotweed seems to be, to me, the most aggressive and the most damaging to an ecosystem. So I'm okay letting, mugwort or some multiflora rose go because I know maybe we can
Yeah.
manage that later.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think about, like assess the whole area, right? Like I like to think about what's spreading, right? What's spreading quickly. Is the knotweed increasing or does it seem like it's sort of staying in the same sort of patch, right? So what's spreading or what's damaging to other species, right? So some of our vines really damage some of our trees. So prioritizing that. And sometimes you have to prioritize reducing seed volume for propagation. So that can be a thing that you work on for a few years. Like maybe you can't, the first time you're treating an area, you can't eradicate everything, but if you can sort of slow the spread of these species, or also thinking about like we don't want to just clear cut the whole area, right? And sort of get rid of all the habitat. So maybe focusing on smaller, breaking it up into smaller patches where you can continue to monitor that area for regrowth, I think is an important thing because, we do know that some of these species are providing habitat, providing foraging for, the animals and birds. So we don't want to clear cut a whole area. Yeah.
Kay, thank you. Kay, you had a question?
Yes, excuse me. You talking about the knotweed
Yeah.
and in terms of trying to get rid of it or control it. I don't know, I've been told that if you cut it gets stronger, or if you try pulling it, it gets stronger. So what would you do?
So We actually did a study at the garden probably about 10 or 15 years ago. And we were looking at two different treatment methods, right? So we were looking at cutting it down, and then we were looking at trying to dig it out and remove it, versus our control where we didn't do anything, right? And what we found was that digging it out and cutting it down were basically the same efficacy for control. Um, and so, but compare that to the control, right? The control was no biodiversity. Like if you just have knotweed and you let it go, you will get zero other plants growing in that area. You'll get zero regeneration of any woody species. You get zero amounts of herbaceous species. And what we found was that when we cut it down, we were getting all these other things sort of growing up in between it. And I think our goal for something like knotweed can't be eradication of that species, because I don't think that's always practical. So if we can reduce the effects of that species on neighboring species, I think that's the best that we can do. So what we found is that we cut it down 3 times a year, and we've really gotten a lot of regeneration of other plants, especially woody plants in the area. And to us, that's pretty good. So
Great, thank you.
yeah, so I would try cutting it down, maybe using some like hedge trimmers or something a few times a year.
Right. It's right on the edge of our property, so it's like
Yeah.
you just want to make sure it doesn't,
Yeah. And also when we cut things down, I know everyone says that knotweed seeds are not viable, but they've done studies and a lot of the seeds actually are viable. So if we can prevent it from going to seed and spreading to other areas, that's really beneficial too.
and when you cut it down, can you put that into a place where you're composting, or does that go into the garbage?
So there is like a little bit of debate, right, on what to do with that material. And so uh, what I've read, right, and I've never actually seen this happen, is that if you cut it down and you leave that material on the ground, it could sprout from that material that you left on the ground. However, I have cut down a lot of knotweed, and generally what happens is that pretty quickly that top material that you cut down shrivels up and dries up pretty quickly, and I've never seen it sprout. I think what can be kind of problematic is that there's a little bit of an area between the rhizome and the above ground material where there could be some ability for it to sprout. However, just with the herbaceous stuff, I've never seen it sprout before. So what I do, and actually because they don't want the knotweed in our compost pile either, we leave it on the ground, just the above ground material. So we cut it and then we just leave it to decompose on the ground.
Okay.
So that way, if there is a chance that it's spreading, right, like, or that it can regrow from that top part, at least it's in the area where it's already growing and you're not putting in your compost and spreading it
Yeah.
in new areas, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And anyone else with spoken questions before I move on to the chat?
I have a question. We're here in Westchester County, and we're right near Rockefeller State Park, and we bird there a
Yeah.
lot with Sawmill River, Audubon. Anyway, what we're noticing is there's a huge spread of porcelain berry,
Mm-hmm.
but we're noticing that the birds are eating it. We're getting huge
Yeah.
warbler migrations. We had a yellow-bellied sapsucker on it. And so I think we're seeing some evolution of birds. And we also have a problem with deer eating our understory.
Yeah.
So these invasives now are providing shelter for our ground nesting birds. And if we get rid of all the porcelain berry, we have goats there. They're eating a lot of the invasives for us. But if we get rid of it all, then we create a vacuum
Mm-hmm.
where the birds come back and there's no understory, and the birds that are, and we think the porcelain berry might not be as nutritious. They're eating it like crack.
Yeah.
And but they're eating a lot of it. But if they have nothing, then we have a problem in migration.
Yeah. It's kind of the deer. So I don't have a serious deer. We don't have any deer at the garden. So I've never really dealt with a lot of deer foraging, but that sort of creates, a separate problem where that you're not getting the regeneration of the understory.
The forest, you could see through all the forests. I'm extensive
Yeah.
hiker. You could see through forests you never used to.
Yeah, it's like a very, you know, I wish there was a simple answer. I feel like as far as the management of the porcelain berry, I do think it's kind of important to, like I was saying to somebody else, like, not accepting that these species do have value for the birds and for the other animals. And if we don't want them, we have to provide some sort of replacement for them, right?
Like this is huge swaths.
Yeah.
And then my other question, I went out on the Sawmill River Parkway, which all our parkways in Westchester have been devoured by these vines.
Yeah.
And there was a group and they had planted some trees along the sawmill and then they were cutting the invasives. And I went to join them. And after pulling two of them, I realized that there's no way I could do this. And I looked around and what they were doing was amazing but daunting.
Yeah.
And I said to them, why are you not using power saws or power stuff like my gardeners when they come and just go right across my hedges?
Yeah.
Why are you not using power tools to get it out of the ground?
So as far as like using power tools to cut things, I mean, I'm assuming they were mostly just volunteers who were getting stuff from their house. And
Yeah,
that's
but they said they had never thought about this and they
uh
can get money to do this. And
yeah.
they looked at me like I had two heads. I'm also doing for Sawmill River Audubon, we're looking for an invasives presenter. So I'd love your contact information. This was
Okay.
great. And so yeah, if you can send me that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Um, I don't like so I don't use a lot of power equipment. We don't have, I think, the same issues that you guys have with like density of invasives in that forest because we've been managing for 15 years. Um, However, I would say that some of the downside of power tools, and I don't know what kind of ecosystem you're dealing with, but it can be very easy to cut down everything and not to be selective about what you're cutting. So that could be a downfall too. Or if they are volunteers, I work with a lot of volunteer groups and there's not very many people I would just want to just randomly give power tools to if they're not experienced. So sometimes the hand tools can be a little bit safer and more accessible for people to use, It's like you could have more people, a larger group of people doing it.
That first question tied into one of my questions because you mentioned that there are some cases where the non-native plants are actually beneficial to the birds in some way.
Yeah.
I guess you have to go on a case by case basis, but is there a general recommendation? Well, um, get rid of all of them and provide a replacement, or leave some, get rid of a lot of it and leave some.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's like when everything that we're talking about with environmental issues, I don't think there's a black and white, right and wrong for everything. So it's really hard to say like, oh, this is good and this is bad because, everything is within a context. So I think that we need to think about these species and think about how they are surviving and what we're able to do in that area. Like, if we're not able to manage an area, is it really beneficial to come and cut down all the trees and shrubs just because they're not native? If we can't manage that area and manage what's going to regrow in that area, because it might not be perfect, but it's providing some sort of benefit.
Right.
And it is something that I think people have talked about, and it's something that there's like this whole nativist movement that some people are having a backlash against, because we have a lot of our areas, our natural areas are really degraded, and maybe our natives wouldn't be able to succeed in them, you know? Some of our urban areas are urban parks, you know? So it's something to think about, is that do these species have a place somewhere? Can they still provide benefit for us?
Sure. I'm going to read the questions from the chat, and then I have one more question of my own.
Okay.
So Cynthia is asking, if one is removing mugwort that has seeds, can one put it in yard waste, or should it go in garbage? And also, what is the best way to eradicate bamboo?
Bamboo.
Mugwort and bamboo.
I'm assuming the bamboo that spreads through the ground, huh?
I would think.
Yeah. I've actually never dealt with bamboo. I'm assuming it has a pretty intense root system. So I think you would have to do a lot of management of the roots. I really like to use pitchforks for digging out a lot of things that, for digging out things that have a lot of roots, because a lot of people try to use shovels, and what happens is that you end up chopping through the roots. And so if you can use a pitchfork to get in there and loosen up the roots in the soil, you can a lot of times pick out a lot of the roots without cutting them. So that's what I would recommend for bamboo. You probably want to start by cutting it down. Yeah.
Doesn't sound like an enviable task.
No, that one's probably similar to knotweed, I imagine. As far as mugwort, I don't know about mugwort seed viability in compost. I do not know about that. We put everything in our compost pile. I think if you were super concerned about it, you know, cutting off the top part, you know, like you don't want to throw all of that stuff in the trash because you're going to generate a lot of waste that you don't want to put in the trash. But if you can cut off the fruits and then compost the stems, if you were concerned about the seeds. But yeah, I don't know about the viability of the seeds in the compost per se.
Sounds like a good solution. Okay, Kara.
Yeah, I'll do that with certain things. So
sure. Okay, Kara already asked her question, I believe. Justine has a comment, and this is going back to knotweed. I have seen it regenerate, sprout from a cutting.
Oh yeah?
But in general, I just pile it up in big heaps, and it kind of self-composts.
Yeah.
And if you compost it in an area where there is already knotweed, you aren't spreading it.
Yeah.
Comment about
Interesting. I wonder if that was the sprouting was really close to where it was growing from the ground.
Right.
Because I do think there's like a little bit of a gray area between the above ground and the below ground. And I think if you get a little bit of the, you know, the rhizome, which might stick out above the ground a little bit. Yeah.
Well, I'll if no one else has any more questions, I'll just ask my other question and then close out. I'm thinking about Croton Point Park. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's become overrun by quote unquote invasives, and a letter has been going around petitioning for herbicides to be used.
Yeah.
And that ties in with my other question, which is, are there examples you can point to? I know you lean away from using herbicides, but are there situations where you find it to be absolutely necessary for one reason or another?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is kind of one of those things that if we don't have to use it, you know, we shouldn't, right? And I do think that most homeowners, if you have like a small enough area, that it shouldn't really be necessary, you know, but in large areas, in forest, we really lack the resources and the people to manage them properly. And so sometimes herbicide can be quicker, faster, more effective treatment. So, and there are ways of doing it where you're minimizing impacts onto other species. So like if it is woody species, instead of using like a backpack sprayer, right, where you would have, like a mist going out would have like a, sometimes the smallest you can get is about a foot radius. So when you're spraying, that's about the smallest that you can get. Using paintbrushes and painting herbicide onto plants can be a little bit more selective.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Interesting. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much. We appreciate all the information here and hearing you speak and the chance to pick your brains about particular species. Thank you everyone for attending. And please check out our website, brssaudubon.org, for information about field trips. Again, this Sunday we have Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge, and then the Christmas bird count, and all sorts of other trips, as well as a full slate of future speaker programs for the coming year. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Kara, did you get my email address?
I left you my phone number.
Oh, is it in the chat?
Can you just give it to me and I'll take it down? I was at Croton Point Park today also. I led a group of 31 hikers and I talked about the birds and we talked all about invasives and I give them a quiz after. That was great, but it's being eaten and we are talking about the herbicides. Anne Swain, Charlie Roberto, Carolyn Lamb are really involved in this, talking with Mark.
What are the vines mostly? The bittersweet and porcelain?
The entire tree line, the entire park, 506 acres, is being eaten alive by invasives. Well, we've lost most of our pines where the great horned owls nested. It's a wasteland. My hiking group they were aghast. They had never seen it before. They didn't know what invasives were, but they hike continuously. The grasslands is being invaded by mugwort, and we're speaking to the Westchester County Parks.
Okay.
They are really on it. I'm doing this webinar on invasives. I pitched it to our advocacy committee. You guys, it's amazing that you did it. Which Audubon are you? I saw this so quickly. Leslie, what Audubon are you?
The Bronx River Sound Shore Audubon.
Thank you. Okay. Is that Sandy Morrissey? No.
Yes, Sandy Morrissey is still there. I've taken over as president, but yes, Sandy Morrissey, Doug Bloom, myself, and the whole crew.
I do the Bluebird thing for her. I monitor a lot of boxes. She's great. I see Carol Summerfield's on here, but maybe she got off. Yeah, she's spoken to my garden club. Yeah, this is great. So yeah, I'd love that. What is your email?
I put it in the chat, but it's EA.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah.
And Kara, you're with Sawmill, or?
Yes.
Thank you for the detailed info about Croton Point Park.
Yeah, that's a county park, or?
So tonight, yeah, it's a county park. Tonight, I missed it, but they're doing a thing on grassland birds.
Oh, okay.
And today we had a northern harrier, we had a bald eagle, 2 red-tailed hawks, a new one showed up, and a bald eagle. So my group was like, what? Oh my God, what are these birds? It was great to educate people, but invasives is like that's my, so I'm learning so much. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we, as a society, we don't really invest in our natural areas like we should. And I think we're coming to the point where we're seeing the consequences of not managing these areas for such a long time, and that people are going to have to start realizing that we have to manage our natural areas. So
I have a
Hi, Bernie.
I have a question. I was listening to public radio the other day, and they had a story about Phragmites and how it's really taken off like everywhere and all that. And what is a way to deal with that? Because it's in a lot of county parks, it's in a lot of wetlands.
Yeah.
It's sort of like that knotweed crowding out everything else.
Yeah. Phragmites is like notoriously really, really hard to manage.
Mm-hmm.
There was a request to see the cat, who's wild.
Oh, How cute. How cute.
Everybody hold up your cats now.
That will be the end of the official recording, but we can keep talking if we want to chat. That is so sweet.